If you walk through the financial district of Riyadh today, you will see monuments to an invisible empire. You will see glass towers that scrape the desert sky, built with revenues from oil that flows endlessly beneath the sand. You will see luxury automobiles gliding past shopping malls that rival anything in Dubai or London. You will see a kingdom that transformed itself from a collection of nomadic tribes into one of the wealthiest nations on earth within a single generation. But what you will not see is the secret agreement that made it all possible, an agreement that did not just enrich Saudi Arabia, but fundamentally reshaped the architecture of global power for the next half-century. An agreement that was never voted upon by any legislature in either country. In the summer of 1974, the world economy was in chaos. The price of oil had quadrupled in a matter of months. Gas stations across America displayed handwritten signs that read, "No fuel today." Drivers waited in lines that stretched for miles, their engines idling, their tempers boiling, their faith in the American system shaken. Inflation was devouring the savings of ordinary families who had done everything right. Factories were shutting their doors and laying off workers by the thousands. The comfortable post-war prosperity that Americans had taken for granted was evaporating before their eyes. The Arab oil embargo had brought the mightiest industrial nation on earth to its knees. But in the corridors of the United States Treasury, a small group of men saw an extraordinary opportunity hidden within the crisis. They understood that the old monetary order, the system that had governed global trade since Bretton Woods, was already dead. President Nixon had killed it 3 years earlier when he severed the link between the dollar and gold. Now the dollar was just paper, backed by nothing but the promise of the American government. The world was losing faith in that promise. They needed something to replace gold. They needed something that every nation on earth required, something so essential that no economy could function without it. They needed oil. This is the story of the petrodollar system. It was not a treaty signed by heads of state. It was a quiet arrangement between Treasury officials and Saudi princes. It forced every nation on earth to hold American dollars. It was the most successful financial coup in modern history. And after 50 years of absolute dominance, it is finally beginning to crack. To understand the petrodollar, we must first understand the system it replaced and the crisis that made it necessary. In July 1944, as Allied troops pushed across France toward Germany, representatives from 44 nations gathered at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war in Europe was not yet won, but these men were already designing the architecture of the post-war world. They created a monetary system that would govern international trade for the next 3 decades and establish America as the undisputed financial center of the global economy. The Bretton Woods Agreement established the United States dollar as the anchor of the global economy. Every participating nation agreed to peg its currency to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at the rate of $35 per ounce. Any foreign government could walk into the United States Treasury with $35 and walk out with 1 ounce of pure gold bullion. It was a promise. It was a guarantee. It was a contract written in metal. It was the foundation upon which the entire global trading system rested. For 25 years, the system worked beautifully. International trade flourished as never before in human history. Currencies were stable and predictable. Businesses could plan investments years in advance. The global economy grew at rates never seen before. Europe rebuilt from the rubble of war through the Marshall Plan. Japan emerged from occupation as an industrial powerhouse. The American middle class expanded into suburban prosperity, buying homes and automobiles and appliances with confidence in the future. It was the golden age of Western capitalism, and the dollar was its foundation. But beneath this prosperity, a fatal flaw was growing like a cancer in the foundations of the system. The United States was spending far more than it earned. The Vietnam War consumed billions of dollars every year, draining the Treasury month after month. The Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, federal housing initiatives, education spending, consumed billions more. The trade deficit widened year after year as American consumers bought German cars and Japanese electronics. Foreign governments, particularly in Europe and Japan, were accumulating American dollars faster than America could accumulate gold to back them. By 1971, the mathematics had become impossible to ignore. Foreign central banks held more than $60 billion in claims against the United States Treasury. The gold reserves sitting in Fort Knox were worth only $11 billion at the official exchange rate. If every creditor tried to redeem their dollars for gold simultaneously, the vault would be empty before a fifth of them had collected their metal. The world's most powerful nation was quietly, secretly, and comprehensively insolvent. The man who understood this better than anyone was John Connally, the Secretary of the Treasury under President Richard Nixon. Connally was a Texan with a politician's instincts and a gambler's nerve. He had been sitting in the limousine with President Kennedy in Dallas and had been wounded by the same bullets that killed the president. He had survived that day to reach the pinnacle of American financial power. He knew that the gold window could not remain open. He knew that the system was hemorrhaging credibility. He also knew that if America acted boldly and decisively, it could turn catastrophe into extraordinary opportunity. In August 1971, Nixon gathered his top economic advisors at Camp David for a secret weekend meeting that would reshape global finance. The participants included Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and a young economist named Paul Volcker, who would later become one of the most consequential central bankers in history. The agenda was simple and terrifying: decide how to end an era. On August 15, 1971, Nixon appeared on national television and delivered what became known as the Nixon shock. He announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at any price. Window was closed. The promise was broken. The anchor of the global monetary system had been cut loose. The dollar was now a fiat currency, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the American government. For the first time in modern history, no major currency in the world was convertible to precious metal. The global economy was adrift on an ocean of paper. The immediate aftermath of the Nixon shock was exactly what the pessimists had predicted and what the optimists had feared. The dollar fell sharply against every major currency in the world. Gold soared in the free market from $35 to over $60 per ounce within months. Inflation accelerated across the entire Western world. Foreign governments, particularly the French under President Georges Pompidou, were furious at what they perceived as an American betrayal of the highest order. They had been holding dollars as a store of value, trusting the American guarantee that those dollars could always be converted to gold at the promised rate. That trust was now shattered beyond repair. But the crisis had only begun its first act. A larger disaster was waiting in the wings. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel during Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The assault caught the Israelis off guard and nearly succeeded in its first hours. The United States rushed to resupply the Israeli military with weapons, ammunition, and equipment. American C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft flew around the clock to deliver tanks and missiles to the embattled Israeli forces. The airlift saved Israel from potential defeat. In response, the Arab members of OPEC announced a comprehensive oil embargo against the United States and its allies. Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter in the world, cut its production by 25% and refused to sell a single barrel to America or any nation that supported Israel. The punishment was immediate and devastating. The price of oil exploded like nothing the world had ever seen. Before the embargo, crude traded at roughly $3 per barrel. By January 1974, it had reached $12 per barrel, a fourfold increase in the price of the most essential commodity on Earth. Think about what that means in practical terms. Every factory that burned oil became 4 times more expensive to operate overnight. Every truck that hauled goods became 4 times more expensive to fuel. Every airplane became 4 times more expensive to fly. Every home that heated with oil saw its bills quadruple. The shock waves rippled through every economy in the Western world. In America, the crisis was visceral and immediate in a way that abstract monetary policy never could be. For the first time since the Great Depression, ordinary citizens felt the fragility of their prosperity in their daily lives. They waited in lines for hours to buy gasoline. They saw their heating bills double and triple. They watched their neighbors get laid off as factories cut back production. They watched the evening news and learned that their country, the mightiest military power in history, could be brought to its knees by a handful of kingdoms in the Arabian desert. But inside the Treasury Department, the crisis was forcing a radical rethinking of American monetary strategy. The key figure in this rethinking was William Simon, a former Wall Street bond trader who became Treasury Secretary in April 1974. Simon was not a career diplomat or a lifelong bureaucrat. He was a man who understood the mechanics of capital flows and the movements of money better than perhaps any person in government. He looked at the situation and saw a paradox that contained the seeds of an extraordinary solution. The Arab oil producers were accumulating vast quantities of dollars from their oil sales, far more money than they could possibly spend in their sparsely populated desert kingdoms. Saudi Arabia alone was receiving billions of dollars every month, more than the entire government budget of many European countries. They had to put those dollars somewhere. If they invested them in Europe or Japan, they would strengthen America's commercial competitors. If they converted them to gold or other currencies, they would further destabilize the dollar that America was desperately trying to protect. But if they could be persuaded to invest those petrodollars back into the United States, something remarkable would happen. The dollars would flow back home to America. They would fund the federal budget deficit without the need to raise taxes. They would purchase treasury bonds, keeping interest rates artificially low and stimulating economic growth. They would buy American weapons and American goods, supporting American industry and American jobs. The oil embargo, which had seemed like an economic attack on the United States, could be transformed into the foundation of a new financial order more powerful than Bretton Woods had ever been. In July 1974, William Simon flew to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, on a mission so sensitive that it was kept secret from almost everyone in the American government. He met with Prince Fahd, who was second in command of the Saudi kingdom and would later become king. He met with the central bank governor and senior officials responsible for the kingdom's finances. He met with influential members of the royal family who controlled the levers of Saudi economic policy. The negotiations lasted for days in the stifling desert heat, in palaces cooled by the finest air conditioning that oil money could buy. Simon offered the Saudis what they wanted most desperately: American military protection against their enemies in a dangerous neighborhood. He offered access to the most advanced American weapon systems, fighter jets, missile systems, tanks, helicopters, and the training to use them. He offered a guarantee that the United States would defend the kingdom against any external threat, whether from revolutionary Iran, from Soviet-backed Iraq, or from any other hostile power. America would be the shield of the House of Saud against all who threatened them. In return, the Saudis agreed to two conditions that would reshape the entire global economy for the next 50 years. First, they would price all their oil exports exclusively in United States dollars. Not in British pounds, not in French francs, not in German marks, not in Japanese yen, not in a basket of currencies, not in gold. Every barrel of Saudi oil sold anywhere in the world would be denominated in American dollars and only in American dollars. Second, the Saudis agreed to invest their surplus petroleum revenues, the billions upon billions of dollars flowing into Saudi coffers from oil sales, into United States Treasury securities. They would recycle the petrodollars back into American government debt. They would become one of the largest creditors of the United States government. The money would flow from American gas stations to Saudi Arabia and then right back to the United States Treasury in an endless circle of mutual dependence. The agreement was never signed as a formal treaty. It was never submitted to Congress for ratification. It was never debated in public or voted upon by elected representatives. It existed only as an understanding between governments, documented in diplomatic cables that remained classified for 40 years. The American public would not learn the full details until Bloomberg News obtained the declassified documents in 2016, but the effects were immediate and transformative. Saudi Arabia was the swing producer, the nation that controlled the marginal supply of oil and could set the price for the entire global market. Where Saudi Arabia led, the other OPEC nations followed. By December 1974, OPEC as a whole had agreed to price oil exclusively in United States dollars. This single decision created a structural demand for dollars that was entirely independent of America's actual economic productivity. Every country on Earth that needed to import oil, which was every industrial economy without substantial domestic production, first had to acquire American dollars before they could purchase a single barrel. Germany needed dollars, Japan needed dollars, France needed dollars, Italy needed dollars, Brazil needed dollars, India needed dollars, China needed dollars. The entire planet was suddenly locked into a system where the American currency was not just useful, not just preferred, but absolutely mandatory for economic survival. The genius of the petrodollar system was that it created demand for American dollars that had nothing to do with American exports or American economic productivity or American industrial competitiveness. Under the old Bretton Woods system, foreign governments held dollars because they could be redeemed for gold at a guaranteed rate. Under the new petrodollar system, foreign governments held dollars because they had absolutely no choice in the matter. Oil was the lifeblood of industrial civilization, as essential as blood is to the human body. Without oil, factories stopped producing goods, trucks stopped delivering food to supermarkets, ships stopped sailing across oceans. Airplanes stopped flying passengers and cargo, armies stopped moving across battlefields, and the only currency that could purchase this essential commodity was the United States dollar. This arrangement gave the United States an extraordinary privilege, perhaps the most extraordinary privilege any nation has ever possessed in peacetime. America could print money to pay for imports from the rest of the world, could run trade deficits year after year, decade after decade, without ever facing the day of reckoning that would force other nations to adjust their behavior. It could borrow at interest rates that no other nation could match, because the global demand for treasury bonds was structurally guaranteed by the worldwide need for dollar reserves. French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it the exorbitant privilege. He was absolutely correct in his assessment. It was exorbitant beyond measure. And it was about to be severely tested. The late 1970s brought inflation that seemed completely unstoppable. The dollar lost nearly a third of its purchasing power against the German mark and the Japanese yen. Gold, which was supposed to have been permanently demonetized and relegated to jewelry and dental fillings, soared from $100 per ounce to over $800 by January 1980. The Carter administration projected weakness and uncertainty on the world stage. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 removed the Shah, a key American ally, from power and triggered a second devastating oil shock. Oil prices doubled again. Gas lines returned to American cities. For a brief moment, it seemed that the entire petrodollar system might collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions. But the system had a defender, a man willing to inflict enormous pain on the American economy and the American people to preserve the dollar's primacy in global trade. Paul Volcker, the same young economist who had been at Camp David in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window, was now chairman of the Federal Reserve. In October 1979, Volcker announced that the Fed would stop targeting interest rates in the traditional manner and would instead focus on controlling the money supply directly. The practical effect was an explosion in interest rates that no one in the financial markets had thought possible. The prime lending rate reached 21.5% in December 1980. 30-year mortgage rates hit 18%, meaning that homebuyers would pay nearly $3 in interest for every dollar of principal. The cost of borrowing money became so prohibitively expensive that economic activity simply froze in place. Businesses stopped investing in new equipment and new employees. Homebuyers stopped buying homes. The unemployment rate climbed to nearly 11%, the highest since the Great Depression. Entire industries were devastated. The manufacturing heartland of the American Midwest, already struggling, began its long and painful decline into the Rust Belt. But Volcker's shock therapy worked exactly as intended, even if the cost was terrible. Inflation fell from 13.5% in 1980 to just 3.2% by 1983. The dollar stabilized and then strengthened dramatically against every major currency in the world. Foreign capital, attracted by the highest real interest rates in memory and a suddenly strong and stable currency, poured into the United States from Europe, Japan, and the oil-producing states. The petrodollar system, which had seemed on the verge of collapse just 3 years earlier, was reinforced and expanded beyond anything its original architects had imagined. The crisis had passed. The lesson was clear to every government watching from around the world. The United States would pay any price, including a devastating recession that destroyed millions of jobs and ruined countless lives and families, to defend the dollar's primacy in global trade. The message was received. The 1980s and 1990s became the golden age of dollar dominance. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, removing the only ideological alternative to American-led capitalism. China, after the market reforms of Deng Xiaoping, joined the global trading system, but on terms that required it to accumulate massive dollar reserves to manage its exchange rate and keep its currency competitive. The European economies, despite creating the euro in 1999 as a potential rival, continued to hold the majority of their reserves in dollars and to price their commodity imports in American currency. By the turn of the millennium, the dollar accounted for over 70% of global foreign exchange reserves and was used in over 85% of all foreign exchange transactions worldwide. The American financial imperium was at its absolute peak. For 50 years, the the petrodollar system operated as the invisible architecture of American hegemony, the hidden foundation upon which everything else was built and everything else depended. It was not taught in American schools. It was rarely discussed in mainstream media or debated by politicians. Most Americans had no idea that their currency's global dominance rested on a secret agreement negotiated in the desert between Treasury officials and Saudi princes, an agreement that no one in either country had ever voted to approve. But those who understood international finance understood that this system was the bedrock upon which American power was constructed. The aircraft carriers patrolling every ocean, the military bases in 140 countries, the ability to impose sanctions that could destroy any economy on Earth, the capacity to finance trillion-dollar deficits year after year without obvious consequence. The arrangement transformed Saudi Arabia beyond recognition within a single generation. When the agreement was first negotiated in 1974, the kingdom was still building its basic infrastructure. Roads, hospitals, schools, modern cities, all of this lay in the future, waiting to be constructed from the desert sand. By 2024, Saudi Arabia had accumulated sovereign wealth funds worth over $900 billion. It had purchased hundreds of billions in American weapons systems. F-15 Eagle fighters, F-15 Strike Eagle attack aircraft, Patriot missile batteries, Apache attack helicopters, AWACS surveillance aircraft, precision-guided munitions, naval vessels, and the training and maintenance contracts to keep them operational. It had recycled its oil revenues into American financial assets with such consistency that the kingdom became one of the largest foreign holders of United States Treasury securities, financing American deficits with petrodollars that had originated in American gas stations. But the petrodollar system contained fundamental contradictions that would eventually rise to the surface and demand resolution. The first contradiction was moral, and it became increasingly difficult to ignore. The United States had tied its financial architecture to an absolute monarchy where women could not drive automobiles until 2018, where political dissent was punishable by public beheading in the central square, where the state religion was the same Wahhabi interpretation of Islam that had inspired al-Qaeda's violent ideology. When 15 of the 19 hijackers on September 11, 2001, turned out to be Saudi citizens, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. American soldiers were dying in Afghanistan to fight an ideology that the Saudi state was simultaneously propagating through its worldwide network of madrasas and Islamic schools. Yet the financial relationship continued unchanged because neither side could afford to break it. The second contradiction was strategic. The petrodollar system required that oil remain priced exclusively in dollars, which required that Saudi Arabia remain dominant in global oil markets, which required that no alternative supplier emerge that might be willing to break the arrangement and accept other currencies. But the rise of Russia as a major oil and natural gas exporter in the 2000s created exactly such an alternative. Russia had no loyalty to the dollar system that underpinned American power. Russia had deep grievances against the United States dating back to the humiliating treatment it had received in the 1990s when American advisors oversaw the chaotic privatization of Russian industry. Russia had every incentive to undermine a financial architecture that reinforced American power at Russian expense. The third contradiction was geopolitical, and it grew larger every year. The rise of China as the world's largest trading nation and second-largest economy meant that a country the United States increasingly viewed as its primary strategic competitor was also one of the largest holders of dollar reserves and treasury securities. China accumulated over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, the largest hoard of American IOUs in human history. China was locked into the dollar system by the sheer size of its existing holdings, trapped by its own success. If China tried to sell its dollars quickly, it would destroy the value of its own remaining reserves. But China resented this vulnerability intensely. Every time the United States threatened sanctions against a third country, every time it weaponized the SWIFT international payment system to punish adversaries, every time it froze the assets of a foreign government, it reminded the Chinese leadership of the existential risk of depending on American financial infrastructure that could be turned against them at any moment. The breaking point came in February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its European allies responded with the most aggressive financial sanctions in modern history. They froze the foreign currency reserves of the Russian central bank, approximately $300 billion in assets held in Western financial institutions. Overnight, money that Russia thought it owned became money that Russia could not touch. They cut major Russian banks off from the SWIFT messaging system that enables international payments. They demonstrated in the most dramatic fashion possible that dollar assets could be seized at will by the American government whenever it chose to do so. The sanctions may well have been justified by the brutality of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. That is a separate argument. But the sanctions sent an unmistakable message to every government in the world that held substantial dollar reserves. Your assets are only yours as long as the United States of America permits them to remain yours. The exorbitant privilege had become an exorbitant threat. Countries that had never cooperated on anything in their history suddenly began discussing alternatives to the dollar-based financial system. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, announced plans to develop alternative payment mechanisms that would bypass the dollar entirely. They discussed creating a new reserve currency backed by a basket of commodities. Saudi Arabia, the original and essential partner in the petrodollar arrangement, began accepting Chinese yuan for oil sales to China. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia announced it would join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a dialogue partner. It began negotiations to join the BRICS grouping. The kingdom that had anchored the petrodollar system for half a century was hedging its bets for the first time. The numbers tell a story of gradual but accelerating erosion of dollar dominance. In the year 2000, the dollar accounted for approximately 71% of global foreign exchange reserves, an overwhelming dominance that seemed permanent and unchallengeable. By 2023, that share had fallen to below 58%. The decline was slow, almost imperceptible on a quarterly basis, barely visible in any single data release. But the direction was unmistakable, and the pace was accelerating with each passing year. Central banks in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America were systematically diversifying away from dollar holdings. They were buying gold. Central bank gold purchases reached their highest levels in decades in 2022 and 2023. They were buying yuan. They were buying anything that could not be frozen by an American executive order. But the dollar's decline is not a collapse. It is a transition measured in decades, not months or years. The uncomfortable truth is that there is no ready alternative that can absorb the trillions upon trillions of dollars currently held as reserves around the world. The Chinese yuan is not fully convertible. The Chinese government maintains strict capital controls that prevent the free movement of money across its borders, because opening those controls would threaten the Communist Party's grip on the economy. The euro lacks a unified bond market and a unified fiscal policy. It nearly tore itself apart during the Greek debt crisis and remains structurally fragile. Gold cannot be used for day-to-day commercial transactions in a modern economy. Cryptocurrencies remain too volatile and too limited to serve as a global reserve. The dollar remains dominant not because it is loved, not because it is trusted, but because the alternatives are worse. The system is fragmenting, but it is not replacing itself. What this means for ordinary Americans is still unclear, but the general direction is not encouraging. For decades, the petrodollar system allowed the United States to consume more than it produced, to import more than it exported, to borrow at rates that should have been impossible for a nation with debts measured in tens of trillions of dollars. If that privilege erodes significantly, the adjustments will be painful and unavoidable. Higher interest rates as foreign demand for Treasury bonds weakens, a weaker currency that makes imports more expensive, a lower standard of living relative to the rest of the world. The story of the petrodollar is the ultimate lesson in the fragility of financial architecture that seems permanent. The men who designed the system in 1974 thought they were solving a temporary crisis with a clever improvisation. They did not imagine that their improvised solution would become the foundation of global finance for half a century. And they could not have predicted that the very power the system conferred, the ability to weaponize the dollar itself, would eventually become the catalyst for its undoing. The towers in Riyadh still gleam in the desert sun. The oil still flows through the pipelines. The dollars still circulate around the world. But beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of global finance are shifting in ways that the original architects never anticipated and may not be able to control. The agreement negotiated in Jeddah in 1974 was never meant to be permanent. It was a tactical response to a tactical crisis. A clever improvisation by men who needed to solve an immediate problem and did so brilliantly. But it became the skeleton key that opened every door for American power for the next 5 decades. It allowed Washington to finance wars without raising taxes on the American people. It allowed the Federal Reserve to print money without immediate consequences. It allowed the American consumer to purchase the products of the entire world without worrying about the trade deficit. Those who benefit from such privileges rarely imagine they might end. They assume the future will resemble the past. They forget that every empire that ever existed believed itself to be eternal until suddenly it was not. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. But for the first time in 50 years, that status is no longer guaranteed by a handshake in the desert. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.